Rosa had always felt different in her small village in Mexico. While other girls her age were busy with their babies and toddlers, she spent her days helping her mother with cooking and cleaning. 3 years had passed since her wedding day. 3 long years of prayers and visits to the local church, hoping for a miracle that never came. The village women whispered behind her back. She could see them pointing when she walked to the market. Their eyes followed her everywhere, filled with pity and judgment. In their world, a woman who couldn't have children was considered cursed or broken. Rosa tried to ignore the stares, but each glance felt like a knife cutting deeper into her heart. Her husband, Diego, had been patient at first. He would hold her hand and tell her that God's timing was perfect. But as months turned into years, his patience grew thin. He started coming home later from work. He stopped talking to her during meals. The silence in their small house became so thick that Rosa felt like she was drowning in it. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when the village healer, an old woman named Esperanza, examined Rosa behind closed curtains. The examination was uncomfortable and embarrassing. Esperanza pressed and prodded, muttering prayers under her breath. When she was done, she looked at Rosa with sad eyes and shook her head slowly. "Mija," the old woman said softly, "your womb is cold. The life inside you sleeps too deeply. You will never wake it up." Those words hit Rosa like a physical blow. She stumbled out of the healer's house, her vision blurry with tears. The walk home felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step was heavy, every breath painful. She knew what this meant. In her village, this diagnosis was worse than a death sentence. Diego was waiting for her when she got home. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. He didn't shout or get angry. Instead, he sat down heavily at their kitchen table and put his head in his hands. The silence stretched between them like a canyon that neither could cross. Sorry, Rosa whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was apologizing for something beyond her control. Diego didn't look up. "I need sons to carry on my family name," he said quietly. "My father expects grandchildren. The whole village is watching us." Within a week, Diego had spoken to the village priest about ending their marriage. The process was swift and brutal. Rosa had to stand in front of the entire congregation while the priest announced that their union was being dissolved due to her inability to fulfill her wifely duties. The shame burned through her like fire. She moved back into her parents' small house, the same room she had slept in as a child. Her father, Manuel, was a proud man who had once been successful. He owned a small farm where he grew corn and beans. But the last 2 seasons had been disasters. First came the drought that killed half his crops. Then the floods that destroyed what little remained. The debts piled up like mountains around their family. Rosa's mother, Carmen, tried to be supportive, but the stress was wearing on everyone. The house that had once been filled with laughter now felt like a prison. Rosa could hear her parents arguing late at night, their voices carrying through the thin walls. They talked about money they didn't have, debts they couldn't pay, and a daughter they didn't know how to help. The worst part was the way people in the village looked at her now. She was no longer Rosa, the baker's daughter. She was Rosa, the barren woman. Children were told not to get too close to her, as if infertility was something they could catch. Even her old friends started avoiding her, afraid that being seen with her would bring bad luck to their own families. Rosa spent her days helping her mother with household chores and trying to make herself useful. She learned to cook new dishes, hoping to contribute something valuable to the family. But she could feel the weight of being an extra mouth to feed in a house that was already struggling to survive. One evening, as Rosa was sweeping the front yard, she noticed 2 men talking quietly with her father near the fence. They were strangers, well-dressed in a way that stood out in their poor village. One was tall and thin with gold teeth that flashed when he smiled. The other was shorter and a rounder, with small dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Rosa tried not to stare, but something about the men made her uncomfortable. They spoke in low voices with her father for almost an hour. She could see money changing hands, though she couldn't hear what was being discussed. When the men finally left, her father came inside looking troubled but also relieved in a way that confused Rosa. "Who are those men, Papa?" she asked. "Just some businessmen," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Rosa did worry. Over the next few days, her parents behaved strangely. They whispered more than usual and stopped talking whenever she entered the room. Her mother started crying at random moments, then quickly wiping her tears and pretending nothing was wrong. Her father spent long hours staring out the window as if he was waiting for something. A week later, the same two men returned. This time, they brought a truck and parked it outside the house. Rosa was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard voices in the front yard. Through the window, she could see her parents talking with the strangers again. The conversation seemed more urgent this time, and her mother kept shaking her head while the men nodded toward the house. Rosa's heart began to race. Something was very wrong, but she couldn't understand what was happening. She stayed by the window trying to hear the conversation, when suddenly her father called her name. "Rosa, come outside, mija. We need to talk to you." Her legs felt weak as she walked toward the front door. The two strange men were smiling, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They looked at her like they were examining merchandise at the market. "Rosa," her father began, his voice shaking slightly, "these men have offered you an opportunity. A chance for a better life in America." The taller man stepped forward. "Señorita, we help young women find good jobs across the border. Factory work, cleaning houses for rich families. You'll earn more money in 1 month than your family sees in a year." "But I don't want to leave," Rosa said, looking between her parents and the strangers. "This is my home. Mia," her mother said, tears streaming down her face. "We can't take care of you here. You have no husband, no children. What kind of future can we give you? These men say there are opportunities in America for women like you." The shorter man pulled out a stack of papers. "All legal, señorita. Work visas, transportation, everything arranged. You'll live in a nice house with other girls, and you'll send money back to help your family." Rosa felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "You're selling me," she whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "We're giving you a chance," her father said, but he couldn't look at her face. "The farm is gone, Rosa. We have nothing left to offer you here. At least this way you can have a future." The men were patient while Rosa stood frozen in shock. They had done this before many times. They knew how to handle confused and frightened young women. They spoke about opportunities and new beginnings while Rosa's world crumbled around her. You have 1 hour to pack your things," the tall man said kindly. "The truck leaves tonight." Rosa looked at her parents, hoping to see some sign that this was all a terrible joke. Instead, she saw guilt and desperation in their eyes, but also a terrible kind of relief. She realized that to them, she had become a burden they could no longer carry. Her infertility hadn't just cost her a husband and children. It had cost her a place in her own family. With numb fingers, Rosa packed her few belongings into a small bag. Her mother gave her a rosary that had belonged to her grandmother, pressing it into her hands while sobbing apologies. Her father handed her what little money he could spare, his hands shaking as he placed the bills in her palm. "We love you, Mija," her mother whispered. "This is for the best. You'll see." But Rosa could see the truth in their eyes. They were choosing survival over love, financial relief over family loyalty. In their minds, they had already lost one daughter to infertility. Now they were losing her again, but this time by choice. The truck was already loaded with 6 other young women when Rosa climbed into the back. Some were crying quietly, others stared ahead with blank expressions. The oldest couldn't have been more than 25, and the youngest looked barely 18. They were all running from something or being pushed toward something else. As the truck pulled away from her village, Rosa pressed her face to the small window and watched her home disappear into the darkness. Her parents stood in their doorway, holding each other and watching her leave. She wanted to hate them for what they had done, but all she felt was a terrible, aching sadness. The other women in the truck shared their stories in whispered voices. Maria was escaping an abusive husband. Luz was trying to earn money for her sick mother's medicine. Carmen had been promised a job as a nanny for a wealthy family. Each had been told something different, but they all shared the same desperate hope that tomorrow would be better than today. Rosa touched the rosary her mother had given her and prayed to a God who seemed to have forgotten her completely. She had lost her husband, her chance at children, her place in her community, and now her family. As the truck carried her toward an uncertain future, she wondered if there was anything left of the person she used to be, or if that girl had died. The truck ride to the border took 2 days and felt like a lifetime. Rosa and the other 6 women were crammed into the back of the vehicle with barely enough room to stretch their legs. They were given water twice a day and small portions of stale bread that tasted like cardboard. The truck stopped only when absolutely necessary, and privacy was a luxury none of them could afford. The man with gold teeth, who told them to call him Carlos, checked on them every few hours. He would slide open a small window between the truck bed and the cab, counting heads like they were livestock. "Everyone comfortable back there?" he would ask with that cold smile. None of the women answered anymore. Rosa learned the other women's stories during the long, bumpy ride. Luz was only 19 and had 3 younger siblings she was trying to support after their parents died in a factory accident. Carmen was 24 and had been married to a man who beat her so badly that she still flinched when anyone moved, too quickly. Maria was the oldest at 28, and she had been promised a job cleaning houses for a rich American family who would sponsor her citizenship. They all shared the same desperate hope that their sacrifices would be worth something. They talked about the money they would earn and the better lives they would build. Rosa listened but didn't share much about herself. How could she explain that she wasn't running toward opportunity, but away from a family that had given up on her? The border crossing happened in the middle of the night. The truck stopped in what seemed like the middle of nowhere, and Carlos opened the back door. "Out," he ordered. "Quick and quiet." They were in the desert, surrounded by nothing but sand, rocks, and twisted bushes that looked like skeletal hands, reaching toward the sky. The moon was just a sliver, providing barely enough light to see the person in front of you. The temperature had dropped dramatically since sunset, and Rosa shivered in her thin jacket. Carlos and his partner, who they learned was called Raul, led them to a different vehicle. This one was older and more beaten up, with Arizona license plates. "From here you're in America," Carlos announced, "but the real journey is just beginning." The new truck was even more uncomfortable than the first one. The 7 women were squeezed together so tightly that Rosa could feel every bump and pothole in her bones. They drove for hours through winding mountain roads that made several of the women motion sick. The smell in the confined space became overwhelming. Dawn was breaking when they finally stopped at what looked like an abandoned gas station. Rosa could see other trucks parked nearby, and she realized this wasn't their final destination, but another stop on a much larger operation. Men moved around the vehicles, loading and unloading cargo that she knew wasn't merchandise. "Bathroom break," Raul announced, opening the back of their truck. 5 minutes. Stay close." Rosa's legs were so stiff that she could barely walk. The other women looked as exhausted and frightened as she felt. They had traveled hundreds of miles from home. But instead of feeling closer to opportunity, Rosa felt further from safety than ever before. While the women stretched their legs and used the filthy bathroom at the old gas station, Rosa overheard Carlos talking to another man near the trucks. The conversation made her blood run cold. "These 7 are for the agricultural operation in Phoenix," Carlos was saying. "The contractors there pay well for workers who won't complain or cause trouble." "What about documentation?" the other man asked. "Already taken care of," Carlos replied, patting a briefcase. "They'll work for room and board until they pay off their transportation debt. Should take about 3 years, maybe 4 if they don't work hard enough." Rosa felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't a job opportunity. They were being sold into forced labor, and their documents were being used as chains to keep them trapped. She looked around desperately, trying to figure out if there was any way to escape. But armed men surrounded the compound. When they were loaded back into the truck, Rosa tried to tell the other women what she had heard. Some of them refused to believe it, clinging to the promises they had been given. "You're just scared," Luz whispered. Everything will be fine once we get to our destination. But Carmen, who had experienced the worst of human nature through her abusive marriage, understood immediately. "We're in trouble," she said quietly. "Real trouble." The truck continued through the Arizona desert as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The metal walls became furnace hot, and the small amount of water they had been given wasn't nearly enough. Rosa felt dizzy and nauseous, but she forced herself to stay alert. She had a terrible feeling that once they reached their destination, any chance of escape would disappear forever. It was early afternoon when everything changed. The truck suddenly swerved and came to a screeching halt. Through the small window, Rosa could hear shouting and the sound of vehicles surrounding them. Carlos was yelling something in rapid Spanish and Raúl was cursing loudly. "Border Patrol!" someone shouted. "Everyone out, hands up!" The back of the truck flew open, and instead of Carlos or Raúl, Rosa saw men in uniform with guns drawn. "Stay calm," one of the officers ordered in both English and Spanish. "You're safe now." But safety was a relative term. The scene outside, the truck was chaos. Multiple vehicles surrounded them, lights flashing and radios crackling. The officers separated the women from their captors, but Rosa could see the confusion in their eyes. Were the women victims or criminals? In the eyes of the law, the line wasn't always clear. Carlos and Raúl were being handcuffed and placed in separate vehicles. Carlos caught Rosa's eye as they led him away, and his expression made her blood run cold. It promised revenge, retribution, consequences for anyone who testified against him. Rosa realized that even if the law could protect her from immediate danger, she would never truly be safe as long as these networks existed. The Border Patrol officers were kind but overwhelmed. They had rescued 7 women, but they also had procedures to follow and laws to enforce. Rosa and the others were loaded into government vehicles and taken to a processing center, but Rosa could see the uncertainty in everyone's faces. What happened next? During the confusion of people being processed and statements being taken, Rosa saw her chance. The processing center was busy, with officers moving between multiple cases and paperwork piling up on every desk. She was waiting in a plastic chair in a hallway when she noticed that the door to the parking lot was unguarded. Rosa looked around carefully. Most of the officers were busy with Carlos and Raúl, trying to get information about the larger trafficking network. The other women were in different rooms giving their statements and waiting to learn their fate. Rosa knew that entering the system meant months, maybe years, of legal proceedings. It meant being trapped in a different kind of cage, while lawyers and judges decided her future. She thought about her parents who had sold her because they saw no other option. She thought about her village where she would always be known as the broken woman who couldn't have children. She thought about the promises that had led her into this nightmare. None of those places offered the fresh start she desperately needed. When the hallway was finally empty, Rosa stood up and walked calmly toward the exit. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, but she forced herself to move steadily. She pushed open the door and stepped into the Arizona afternoon sun. The processing center was located on the edge of a small town, with desert stretching endlessly in all directions. Rosa had no money, no identification, and no clear destination. She only knew that she needed to get as far away as possible before anyone noticed she was missing. She walked toward the desert, away from the roads and buildings where someone might spot her. The sun was merciless, beating down on her dark hair, and making the rocks and sand shimmer like water. Rosa had no hat, no sunscreen, and only the clothes on her back. She knew it was dangerous, possibly deadly, but staying felt even more dangerous. By evening, Rosa was completely lost. The desert looked the same in every direction, and the mountains in the distance seemed no closer despite hours of walking. Her water was gone and her lips were already cracking from dehydration. She had escaped one nightmare only to walk into another. The first night was the worst. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, and Rosa shivered uncontrollably in her thin clothes. She found a small cave between some rocks and curled up inside, listening to the strange sounds of the desert night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and she heard the scurrying of small animals she couldn't identify. The second day brought hallucinations. Rosa saw water where there was only sand, and she thought she heard her mother calling her name. She stumbled forward, driven by a stubbornness that surprised her. She had survived being sold by her family and nearly trafficked into slavery. She refused to die alone in the desert. By the third day, Rosa was barely conscious. She collapsed near a small stream, her body finally giving up after days without food and minimal water. The sun was directly overhead and she could feel her skin burning, but she was too weak to seek shade. This was it, she thought. This was how her story would end. She closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable. But instead of death, she heard voices. Male voices speaking a language she didn't recognize mixed with English words she could barely understand. Joseph Crow Feather had been teaching his children to track animals when they found her. His 3 kids had been restless all morning, cooped up in their small trailer during the hot Arizona summer. Taking them out to the desert to learn traditional skills was one of the few ways he could still connect them to their Apache heritage while giving them something productive to do. 12-year-old Ayanna was the most skilled tracker of the 3. She moved quietly through the desert brush, pointing out signs that her younger brothers, 9-year-old Kai and 6-year-old Tommy, would have missed completely. Joseph watched his daughter with pride and sadness. She was growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to an adult. "Papa, look," Ayanna whispered, pointing toward a small stream that wound through the rocks. "There's something by the water." Joseph squinted in the direction she was pointing and felt his heart skip a beat. What he had first thought was a pile of discarded clothing was actually a person, lying motionless in the shade of a large boulder. The figure was small and slight, obviously female, and from the looks of her torn and dirty clothes, she had been out in the desert for days. "Stay back," Joseph ordered his children, his voice taking on the firm tone they knew meant business. He approached the unconscious woman carefully, unsure if she was even alive. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her skin was badly sunburned. Dehydration had taken a serious toll, and he could see that she was close to death. Joseph knelt beside the woman and gently checked for a pulse. It was weak, but steady. Her clothes told a story of hardship and desperation. They were cheap and ill-fitting, the kind given to people who had nothing. Her shoes were worn through at the heels, and her hands were covered in cuts and scratches from wandering through the thorny desert vegetation. "Is she okay, Papa?" Tommy asked in a small voice. At 6 years old, he had already seen more sadness than most children his age, but the sight of someone so obviously suffering still frightened him. "She's alive," Joseph replied, carefully lifting the woman in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how dehydrated and malnourished she was, but she needs help right away. "Kai, run back to the truck and get the water jug." Ayanna grabbed the emergency blanket from the supplies. His children moved quickly, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Joseph had taught them that in the desert, you helped anyone who needed it, no questions asked. The harsh landscape didn't care about borders, documentation, or legal status. It only cared about survival. Joseph carried the unconscious woman to his truck, speaking softly to her in Apache even though she couldn't hear him. His grandmother had always said that spirits could hear healing words even when the body was unconscious. He laid her gently in the back seat while his children gathered around with worried expressions. The drive to the reservation clinic took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in Spanish that Joseph could barely understand. She seemed to be calling for her mother, begging for forgiveness, asking why she had been abandoned. Even in her delirium, her pain was obvious. Dr. Martinez at the clinic was used to seeing people in bad condition, but even she was shocked by the woman's state. "Where did you find her?" she asked Joseph, while quickly starting an IV to address the severe dehydration. "By Willow Creek," Joseph replied. "She's been out there for days, maybe longer." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "She's lucky you found her when you did. Another day in this heat would have killed her." She paused, looking at Joseph meaningfully. "She's not from around here. Her clothes, her condition, She's probably undocumented. I have to ask if you want me to call Border Patrol." Joseph looked through the window at his 3 children sitting in the waiting room. Ayanna was helping Tommy with a picture book, while Kai drew sketches of the desert animals they had been tracking. His kids had lost their mother 2 years ago in a car accident that still haunted all of them. They knew what it felt like to be helpless, to need someone to care whether they lived or died. "Let's focus on making sure she survives first," Joseph said quietly. "Everything else can wait." The woman slept for 18 hours straight. Joseph stayed at the clinic longer than he had planned, sending his children home with his sister Beth while he waited to see if the stranger would wake up. Something about finding her had affected him deeply, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way she had looked so small and broken in the desert, or maybe it was the fact that his children had been the ones to spot her first. When Rosa finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was a man sitting in a chair beside her bed. He was Native American, probably in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and long black hair tied back in a simple ponytail. He was reading a book, but looked up immediately when she stirred. "Easy," he said softly, switching from English to slow, careful Spanish. "You're safe. You're at the clinic on the San Carlos reservation." Rosa tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The man reached for a cup of water with a straw and helped her take small sips. The cool liquid felt like a miracle on her cracked lips and swollen tongue. "My name is Joseph," he continued in his careful Spanish. "My children and I found you by the stream. You've been very sick, but the doctor says you're going to be okay." Rosa stared at him, trying to process what was happening. The last clear memory she had was collapsing in the desert, certain she was going to die. Now she was in a clean bed connected to medical equipment, being cared for by a stranger who had no reason to help her. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper. Joseph smiled, and Rosa could see genuine warmth in his expression. "Because that's what people do for each other. At least that's what they should do." Over the next few days, as Rosa recovered her strength, she learned more about the man who had saved her life. Joseph worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local elementary school, a job that paid enough to support his 3 children but didn't leave much extra for emergencies or unexpected expenses. He had been married to a woman named Linda, who died when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car head-on. The tragedy had left Joseph struggling to balance work, parenting, and his own grief. His children were good kids, but they needed attention and guidance that he sometimes felt ill-equipped to provide. Ayanna had stepped into a motherly role that was too mature for her age, while the boys acted out in different ways. Kai had become quiet and withdrawn, and Tommy had developed fears about being left alone. "I'm not doing a great job as a single father," Joseph admitted to Rosa during one of his visits to the clinic. "Linda was the heart of our family. I'm just trying to keep everyone fed and safe." Rosa could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibilities that were too heavy for one person to carry alone. She understood something about loss and starting over, though her circumstances were very different from his. When Dr. Martinez said Rosa was well enough to be discharged, the question of what happened next hung in the air like a storm cloud. Rosa had no money, no identification, and nowhere to go. The clinic couldn't keep her indefinitely, and involving government agencies would likely result in deportation back to a family that had already sold her once. Joseph made his decision that evening, after talking it over with his sister Beth, and thinking about what Linda would have done in the same situation. "You can stay with us," he told Rosa simply, "at least until you figure out what you want to do next." Rosa stared at him in shock. "I can't pay you. I have nothing to offer." "I'm not asking for payment," Joseph replied. "I'm asking if you want help getting back on your feet." The offer was both generous and complicated. Joseph's trailer was small with only 2 bedrooms. The children would have questions, and the community would talk. Taking in an undocumented immigrant was risky, especially for someone who worked at a school and needed to maintain a clean reputation. But Joseph had talked to his children about it, and their response had surprised him. Ayanna, who was usually suspicious of any changes to their routine, had been the most supportive. She looked so sad when we found her, Papa, his daughter had said, like she needed a family to take care of her. Kai had nodded in agreement. Maybe she could teach us Spanish. My teacher says it's good to know other languages. Even little Tommy had been enthusiastic. Will she tell us stories? Mama used to tell the best stories. Joseph's heart had ached at his youngest son's innocent question. The children were hungry for female attention and guidance, for someone to help fill the void their mother had left behind. But he also knew that Rosa was a stranger dealing with her own trauma and loss. He couldn't expect her to become a substitute mother, and it wouldn't be fair to put that pressure on her. When Rosa agreed to stay temporarily, Joseph made the arrangement clear to everyone involved. She would have the couch in the living room, she would help with household tasks as she was able, and she was free to leave whenever she felt ready to move on. No one was trapped, and no one owed anyone anything beyond basic human kindness. The first few weeks were awkward for everyone. Rosa spoke very little English, and Joseph's Spanish was limited to basic phrases he had picked up working with Spanish-speaking families at the school. The children were curious but cautious. Living in Joseph's small trailer meant everyone had to adjust their routines and expectations. The space that had felt cramped for a family of 4 now held 5 people, each dealing with their own emotional challenges while trying to navigate this new arrangement. Rosa insisted on sleeping on the living room couch, despite Joseph's offers to give her the bedroom he shared with Tommy. She kept her few belongings in a small bag that she could grab quickly if needed. Old habits from her trafficking experience made her reluctant to get too comfortable anywhere. She had learned that safety was temporary, and that it was better to be ready to run than to be caught unprepared. The language barrier created funny and frustrating moments throughout each day. Rosa would try to help with dinner, only to discover that American kitchens had different tools and ingredients than she was used to. Joseph would attempt to explain his children's school schedules and activities, gesturing wildly when his Spanish vocabulary failed him. The kids became unofficial translators, proud to show off the few Spanish words they knew and eager to learn new ones. Tommy was Rosa's first real breakthrough. The 6-year-old had no fear or suspicion, only boundless curiosity about this new person in his house. He would climb onto the couch beside her in the evenings, chattering about his day in a mixture of English and the Spanish words he was rapidly acquiring. When Rosa didn't understand something, he would repeat it slowly and loudly, as if volume could bridge the language gap. "Rosa, Rosa," he would call excitedly when he came home from school. "Mira, look." He would show her his artwork, his homework, or some treasure he had found on the playground. Rosa found herself looking forward to these daily reports, and she began helping him with simple tasks like organizing his backpack or practicing his letters. One evening, Tommy climbed into Rosa's lap while she was watching television and fell asleep against her shoulder. Joseph found them there an hour later, both peaceful and content. The sight touched something deep in his heart. Tommy had been clingy and fearful since his mother's death, but he seemed more relaxed with Rosa than he had been in months. Kai was more complicated. At 9 years old, he was old enough to remember his mother clearly, but young enough to desperately miss having a maternal figure in his life. He watched Rosa carefully, studying how she moved through their house and how she interacted with his family. He began leaving small gifts for her: a smooth rock he found in the yard, a drawing of the desert sunset, a flower he picked on his way home from school. Rosa was touched by these offerings, but she was also careful not to misinterpret them. Kai needed a mother, but she was just a temporary guest in their home. She accepted his gifts graciously and began teaching him simple phrases in Spanish, but she tried not to get too attached. Getting attached meant risking more pain when it was time to leave. The breakthrough with Kai came during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power to their neighborhood. Tommy was frightened by the lightning and the sudden darkness, and even Ayana seemed nervous as they fumbled around looking for flashlights and candles. Rosa began telling stories in Spanish, using gestures and simple words to make them understandable. She told them about the rain spirits that her grandmother said brought good luck, and about the lightning that was really just the sky gods playing soccer with clouds. Her voice was soothing and her stories were funny, and soon all 3 children were laughing instead of worrying about the storm. When the power came back on hours later, Kai asked if she would tell them another story the next night. Ayana remained, the most resistant to Rosa's presence. At 12, she had appointed herself the protector of her family's emotional well-being. She had watched her father struggle with grief and depression after her mother died, and she had seen how hard he worked to provide for them. The last thing she wanted was for some stranger to disrupt the delicate balance they had achieved. Rosa understood Ayana's hostility and respected it. The girl was doing what she thought was best for her family, even if it meant being unwelcoming to someone who needed help. Rosa made no attempts to win Ayana over or to challenge her authority in the household. Instead, she simply tried to make herself useful without getting in anyone's way. The change in Ayana's attitude began when Kai came home from school with a fever and stomach pain. Joseph was at work and couldn't leave immediately, and the school nurse said someone needed to pick up the sick child right away. Ayana was panicking, unsure what to do, when Rosa quietly took charge. She walked to the school with Ayana, communicating with the nurse through a mixture of Spanish, English, and gestures. She carried Kai home and put him to bed, making him tea with honey and placing cool cloths on his forehead. When Joseph arrived home an hour later, expecting to find chaos, he instead found his son sleeping peacefully while Rosa sat beside his bed, monitoring his breathing and temperature. "How? Did you know what to do?" Ayana asked Rosa that evening, after Kai's fever had broken and he was feeling better. Rosa explained in her limited English that she had helped care for younger cousins when she was Ayana's age. She had learned about home remedies from her grandmother, and she had experience recognizing when someone was truly sick versus just feeling unwell. Ayana listened carefully, and for the first time she seemed to see Rosa as a resource rather than a threat. The real turning point came a few weeks later, when Joseph was offered overtime hours at the school district. The extra money would help pay for Kai's school supplies and Tommy's new shoes, but it meant longer days and less time with his children. He was torn between financial necessity and his guilt about being away from home even more than usual. Rosa saw his dilemma and offered to help with the children after school. She could walk to pick up Tommy from his elementary school, help Kai with homework, and make sure Ayana got to her after-school activities safely. Joseph was hesitant to accept more help, feeling like he was already taking advantage of Rosa's gratitude for rescuing her. "I want to help," Rosa insisted, using the English words she had been practicing. Family helps family. The word family hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them had intended. They weren't family, not really. They were strangers thrown together by circumstances, people helping each other through difficult times. But somehow, during the weeks Rosa had been living with them, something deeper had begun to develop. Joseph's acceptance of Rosa's offer to help with childcare created a new routine that benefited everyone. Rosa walked to the schools each afternoon, greeting the children with genuine pleasure and listening to their stories about their days. She helped with homework, using their assignments as opportunities to improve her own English while teaching them more Spanish. Cooking became a shared activity that brought unexpected joy to their evenings. Rosa taught the children to make simple Mexican dishes using ingredients they could afford at the local grocery store. Tommy loved helping to roll tortillas, even though his attempts were lopsided and torn. Kai became an expert at chopping vegetables, taking pride in his knife skills and the praise Rosa gave him for being careful and precise. Even Ayana began participating in these cooking lessons, though she pretended it was just because she wanted to learn useful skills for when she was older. Rosa could see through the girl's pretense, but she played along, treating Ayana like the young adult she was trying to become, while still acknowledging that she was just a child dealing with too much responsibility. The evenings became a time for stories, games, and conversation that mixed languages and cultures in ways that felt natural and enriching. Rosa shared tales from Mexican folklore while Joseph told Apache legends that had been passed down through his family for generations. The children absorbed both traditions eagerly, beginning to see themselves as part of something larger and more diverse than they had understood before. Rosa's own healing progressed slowly but steadily during this time. The nightmares became less frequent, and she stopped flinching every time someone entered a room unexpectedly. She began to trust that Joseph and his family meant what they said, that their kindness didn't come with hidden costs or secret expectations, but Rosa also struggled with the knowledge that this situation couldn't last forever. She was living in the country illegally, with no documentation and no clear path to legal status. Joseph was taking risks by harboring her, risks that could affect his job and his ability to care for his children. Eventually, she would need to make decisions about her future that would probably mean leaving the only place where she had felt truly safe since her childhood. Joseph was dealing with his own complicated emotions. He found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, knowing that Rosa would be there with his children. The house felt warmer and more alive with her presence, and his kids were happier and more stable than they had been since Linda's death. But he also felt guilty about those feelings, wondering if he was betraying his wife's memory by caring about another woman. The community's reaction to Rosa's presence was mixed. Some neighbors were supportive, understanding that Joseph was helping someone in need. Others were suspicious or disapproving, worried about the legal implications of harboring an undocumented immigrant or concerned. A year had passed since Joseph found Rosa collapsed by the desert stream, and the changes in all their lives were remarkable. What had started as a temporary arrangement born from emergency and compassion had evolved into something none of them had expected. A real family, bound not by blood or law but by choice and love. Rosa's transformation was the most dramatic. The frightened, broken woman who had been sold by her parents and nearly died in the desert had grown into someone confident and purposeful. Her English had improved dramatically through daily conversations with Joseph and helping the children with their homework. She could navigate the grocery store, communicate with teachers at school events, and even joke with the neighbors who had grown to accept and appreciate her presence. More importantly, Rosa had discovered that her inability to have biological children didn't define her worth as a person or limit her capacity to love and nurture. Tommy, Kai, and Ayana had become her children in every way that mattered. She worried about their grades, celebrated their achievements, comforted them when they were hurt or disappointed, and dreamed about their futures with the fierce protectiveness of any mother. The children had flourished under Rosa's care and attention. Tommy, now 7, was more confident and outgoing than he had ever been. He chattered easily in both English and Spanish, switching between languages without thinking about it. His fears about being left alone had disappeared, replaced by the security of knowing that Rosa would always be there when he came home from school. Kai, at 10, had become Rosa's eager helper in the kitchen and around the house. He took pride in his ability to translate between English and Spanish for neighbors and visitors, seeing himself as an important bridge between cultures. His grades had improved significantly since Rosa began helping him with homework, and his teachers commented on his increased focus and motivation. Ayana, now 13, and dealing with all the challenges of being a teenager, had perhaps benefited the most from Rosa's presence. Having another woman in the house meant she could ask questions about growing up that she couldn't bring herself to discuss with her father. Rosa helped her navigate friendship drama, school stress, and the physical and emotional changes of adolescence with patience and understanding. More than that, Ayana had been able to return to being a child instead of carrying the weight of adult responsibilities. Rosa had gradually taken over many of the household tasks that Ayana had been managing, freeing the girl to focus on school, friends, and the normal activities of a teenager. Joseph watched these changes with amazement and gratitude, but also with growing awareness that his own feelings for Rosa had evolved far beyond appreciation for her help with his children. He found himself noticing the way she hummed while cooking dinner, the gentle patience she showed when helping the kids with difficult homework, the quiet strength she displayed when dealing with challenges that would have overwhelmed someone with less resilience. But Joseph was also wrestling with complicated emotions about moving forward romantically. He still missed Linda deeply and felt guilty about the possibility of loving someone else. He worried about the children's reactions if his relationship with Rosa changed from caregiver to something more intimate, and he was concerned about the practical implications of falling in love with someone whose legal status in the country remained uncertain. The turning point came during a community celebration on the reservation. It was a harvest festival that brought together families from Across the area, with traditional foods, music, and dancing, Joseph's family had attended every year since the children were babies, but this was Rosa's first time participating in an Apache cultural event. Rosa was nervous about fitting in, worried that her presence might be seen as intrusive or inappropriate. But the community had watched her integration into Joseph's family over the past year, and most people had come to respect her genuine care for the children and her positive influence on their household. Elder women at the festival approached Rosa with curiosity and kindness, asking about her background and sharing stories about their own experiences adapting to reservation life. Children who knew Tommy, Kai, and Ayana from school greeted Rosa warmly, having heard about the woman who made the best tamales and helped everyone with their Spanish homework. During the traditional dancing, community members encouraged Rosa to participate. She was hesitant at first, feeling like she might be overstepping cultural boundaries, but Joseph's Aunt Beth took her hand and pulled her into the circle. "Family dances together," Beth said simply, and Rosa realized that she was being welcomed not as a guest but as a member of the community. Watching Rosa laugh as she tried to follow the traditional steps, seeing his children beam with pride as they introduced her to their friends, Joseph felt his heart make a decision that his mind had been avoiding for months. This wasn't just about gratitude or convenience anymore. This was about love, the kind of deep, lasting love that builds families and creates homes. That evening, after the children were asleep, Joseph and Rosa sat on the small porch outside their trailer, looking up at the desert stars. The conversation started with reflections on the festival and gradually moved to more personal territory. "The children seem happy," Rosa said softly, unconsciously using the English phrase Joseph had taught her months earlier. "They are happy," Joseph replied. "Happier than they've been since Linda died. That's because of you." Rosa shook her head. "It's because of all of us. We make each other better." The honesty in her words gave Joseph the courage to say what he had been thinking for weeks. "Rosa, I need to tell you something. My feelings for you have changed. You're not just someone helping with my children anymore. You're someone I care about deeply. Someone I love." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. She had been fighting similar feelings for months, telling herself that romantic love was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was an undocumented immigrant with no legal protections, a woman who had been sold by her own family and trafficked across borders. What did she have to offer someone like Joseph, who deserved stability and certainty? "Joseph," she began carefully, "I care about you too. More than I should, but my situation is complicated. I have no papers, no legal status. Loving me could bring you problems." Joseph reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both new and completely natural. "I've been thinking about that too. There are lawyers who specialize in immigration cases, especially for people who have been victims of trafficking. We could explore options for getting you legal status." "And if there are no options?" Rosa asked quietly. "Then we'll deal with that together," Joseph replied. "I'm not asking you to solve all the legal problems tonight. I'm just asking if you feel the same way I do." Rosa looked at this man who had saved her life, who had opened his home and his heart to her, who had given her back her sense of worth and purpose. "Yes," she whispered. "I love you too. I love all of you." The next few months were filled with practical challenges and emotional milestones. Joseph consulted with an immigration lawyer who specialized in cases involving human trafficking victims. The legal process would be long and complicated, but there were potential pathways to legal status, especially given Rosa's circumstances and her integration into the community. The lawyer, Maria Santos, was encouraging but realistic. "These cases take years, not months," she warned, "and there are no guarantees. But you have several factors working in your favor. You're a trafficking victim, you have community support, and you've been contributing positively to society." Joseph and Rosa decided to begin the legal process while continuing to build their life together. They told the children about their romantic relationship gradually, making sure each child felt comfortable with the changes. The kids' reactions ranged from excitement to confusion to wholehearted approval. Tommy was thrilled. immediately asking if this meant Rosa would be his real mom now. Kai was more thoughtful, asking questions about what would change and whether Rosa would still help him with his Spanish homework. Ayana was initially the most resistant, worried that her father was trying to replace her mother, or that Rosa might leave if things became difficult. Rosa addressed Ayana's concerns directly and honestly. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," she told the girl during a private conversation. "No one could ever do that. Your mother will always be your mother, and that's beautiful and important. I'm just hoping to be someone else who loves you and wants to help you grow up strong and happy." Ayana thought about this for several days before approaching Rosa again. "If you marry Papa, will you stay forever, even if things get hard?" "I will stay as long as your father and all of you want me here," Rosa promised. "And yes, even when things get hard, that's what families do." Joseph's proposal came on a quiet Sunday morning in spring, exactly 18 months after he had found Rosa in the desert. There were no grand gestures or elaborate plans, just the two of them sitting in their kitchen while the children played outside, sharing coffee and planning the week ahead. "Rosa," Joseph said suddenly, reaching across the table to take her hand, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to make this official, to make us a real family in every way possible. Will you marry me?"